Welcome to the Next Gen CMO podcast, where we sit down with seasoned CMOs and emerging talents in sales and marketing to explore the wins and occasional losses that shape today's leaders and the strategic maneuvers that can help propel you to the forefront of B2B marketing.
All right, everyone, welcome to the Next Gen CMO podcast. Today, I am thrilled to welcome my friend Bryan Law to the show. Bryan is the Chief Marketing Officer at SentinelOne, and he's been in this marketing strategy, analytics, e-commerce world for 20 years. He's been very successful growing companies at scale, optimizing go-to-market, building, repositioning brands. I've had the pleasure of working with Bryan as a teammate at Rackspace, as a pseudo competitor between ZoomInfo and Demandbase, and now as a customer here at SentinelOne. So I've seen Bryan in all the angles, and I am so excited that he is here. So welcome to the show, Bryan.
Thank you, Kelly. Really, really excited to be here, and it's been fun going through my journey with you.
Yeah, awesome. Cool. Well, you have a lot of different perspectives, and I love it because I always remember, like in our Rackspace days, you and I kind of saw the world like from different angles, and I think in a really, really healthy way. I think that's what makes teams great. So excited to dive in a little bit on that stuff today, just on how you use your brain, how you use it, the sort of mix of art and science across marketing and everything that goes with that. So before we start, I know I probably just stole a little bit of thunder through that intro, but tell us like in 3 or 4 sentences about your sort of career journey and how you got to where you are right now.
Yeah, and I've learned a lot from you, and I think I've grown a lot because of you, Kelly, on that journey. But yeah, so I mean, the first half of my career was all strategy and analytics, and so I actually only came into marketing when I was working with Kelly. So I think I have an interesting blend of sort of those two different vantage points of, so what does the data tell me, sort of like what is the company trying to achieve, and then how can I effectively leverage the marketing skill set to get there. So I think that's one piece. The second one is I've really thought about how I can take risks that maybe some are less willing to take to advance my career. And so that included working in some far-flung geographies around the world and moving around to different parts of the organization. And I both love that. And I think it's been really helpful as I've looked to sort of try new things and grow. And then I would say the third piece for me is I really do love, and I've appreciated, and this is where I talked a little bit about what I've learned from Kelly, is like the mix that marketing is science and art, and really the role our brains and how we both create and retrieve memories plays in marketing's efficacy.
Yeah, I mean, when you and I met, Bryan was, I think, a chief of staff to our CEO at first, and then moved into marketing, running e-commerce and digital marketing and paid search and display and all of those. And that's probably a pretty good, I mean, that's a strategy to sort of analytics, but there's an art side to it too, on driving click-through rates and engagement on our ads and all of that. And then you own the website too, which I know that even while we were there, you ran through a major redesign of some of the site, which again, that balance of like what's going to be visually appealing, but what's also going to drive conversion and optimization. So I love to hear that.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that was potentially helpful about me coming into those areas is I think we all know that testing is really, really important because we're all going to be wrong. And I think it was particularly true for me because I was probably going to be wrong more often than I was not going to be. And so that importance of testing and taking really good ideas, but actually see what worked and what landed with customers. I think maybe that gave me a jump start to my sort of my penchant for trying things out and testing and then learning and changing.
Yeah, for sure. I just was on a podcast last week with a guy who used to work for me at Gartner, and he is a CRO specialist, like a conversion rate optimization specialist. And we talked so much about the value of testing and what it brings, what you think is going to work. And it's not just things like button colors. It's actually like layout and aesthetics and message and headline and just so many things, and what the offer is and what the ask is and the language and the familiarity and just so many things anyway. So I love the kind of like, how do we extract that from like website testing to organizational testing? How do you embed a little bit of experimentation in your whole company, right? How do you have kind of dollars set aside to test creative ideas? And anyway, I think there's a lot of something in there that's more than just website optimization.
For sure. And maybe funny to say, I think that my favorite conference that I've ever gone to was a conversion rate optimization conference when I was at Rackspace that was based in Austin. I was just like, oh my gosh, it's so cool taking data and sort of what you know about customers and blending it together. So I probably would love your old colleague.
Awesome. Well, cool. Well, so similar to you, I did not grow up in marketing, or I did not start in that. I started in engineering and then ended up in marketing on sort of a pivot out after college sometime. But you did something similar. Your degree is in psychology and philosophy. Is that right?
Yeah.
Yeah. How do you think that, one, how did you make the pivot? Like, how did that take you? If you started in strategy, how did that take you to kind of strategy and analytics? And two, how do you think it has helped you be a better marketer?
Yeah, and practically, I originally thought I wanted to be a politician. So I originally started out with a poli-sci degree and then shifted out. But I mean, when I was in undergrad, the part of psychology that really interested me was neuroscience and sort of how our brains work. And I think it's been incredibly relevant because I do think a really, really important part of marketing is how do we help people form memories, but even actually more important, how do we take existing memories and attach our brands to them and then assist in brand recall? And so I think it's been very relevant. And then from a philosophy perspective, I think the main thing I got out of that was how to listen to other points of view and how to use it to then formulate your own. And I think many times as a CMO, one of the things that I find I'm doing the most is taking very, very different perspectives across the organization and hopefully coming to an outcome that everyone's in an aligned perspective around. And so I think that was probably the part that I got from it. The interim step on sort of the analytics side, yeah, I've always just loved data and math. It wasn't necessarily reflected in my undergrad degrees, but I probably do feel most comfortable. And there's always assessments of, what do you do in times of stress? In
Yeah.
times of stress, I always probably revert back to what does the data tell me and where can I use that as a source of truth and then build from it. But I think it's that combination of trying to understand people, seeing what sort of a data-driven view, and then how you can use those things to then inform overall direction. And then I use it to complement areas I'm probably not as strong on, which is like on the creative side. And so that means, who can I look to is someone who can provide perspective there that I can then hopefully amplify and maybe test out and see if it works.
Yeah. Yeah, that's very cool. Were you thinking that when you went to Georgetown, were you thinking, you know what? This could be great for marketing one day and I'll be able to understand brand and recall? Or what was the original back when
Absolutely,
you're
absolutely.
17-year-old Bryan Law? Like, what did you want to be?
Yeah, so I mean, after deciding I wasn't going to be a politician spending a year on Capitol Hill, I thought I wanted to be a psychologist and then decided against that one. No, I mean, to the point, I mean, I went to business school and Kellogg is known for being a marketing business school, and I actually didn't really take many marketing classes. So marketing wasn't something that was top of mind for me. It was our CEO at Rackspace who said, I think you'd really like this. And I was like, maybe, let me try it out. And he was right. I find it fascinating. Like I get truly jazzed about coming into work and thinking about how can we help our customers and use sort of marketing as a way to educate them about what we can do to help them solve their problems.
Yeah. I love it. I think that's so cool. My son is committing today for college and it's a liberal arts kind of deal. And so I'm like, and I don't know like that world. Like I was an engineer and there was a business school and there was a med school and whatever. And so I'm like, you just pick. So I don't know what liberal arts means. And so I'm like, but what a cool way to open your brain and kind of not, because I don't think any 17-year-olds know what they want to do with their life.
Right.
To actually walk in and just be exposed to so many different ways to think about about the world and just see and then figure out what you're interested in instead of trying to, make up your mind so early in life. So
Yeah.
anyway, very cool.
Just one thing is some of the most interesting things I did when I was at Georgetown were the sort of the side activities I did with professors where we were doing tests. And there was one in particular where essentially it was training people on things that they didn't realize they were being trained on, and then hooking people up to an MRI and then seeing what part of their brains got activated when you actually then tested them. And it was really fascinating how much we learn that we just have no realization that we're internalizing. And to me, many times that's what you're trying to do in marketing is how do you just use repetition and exposure to get people to think more positively about your brand or to think differently about your brand. And so, yeah, definitely was not thinking about my future career in marketing at the time, but a lot of those things I've just found really interesting and valuable.
Yeah, isn't that funny? We just did a brand attribute study to understand like kind of those areas when you think about the 2x2 of brand planning, like what is it where should we be playing because people care about it? And where do we have permission to play because our
Yeah, yeah.
brand has somehow affinity in there and trying to match the two together? And just so interesting because it's all influenced. That permission is so influenced by all the things you're talking about. Like, what are they recalling? What part of their brain are they using? Is the messaging resonating? Where have they like locked us into a category in their head and that's where we need to kind of play? Or do we have sort of wiggle room to move? I guess it's not really art or science. The combination behind it is pretty fascinating.
Yeah. Well, and actually, it was a book I read when we were working together, How Brands Grow, and the Ehrenberg
Mhm.
Bass Institute, that I think has shaped a lot of my thinking, sort of all of their books around how marketing should work, which is this idea that we have buying situations. In those buying situations, we have certain mental triggers. And marketing can be most effective if you just tap into those triggers and then increase the brand association. Whereas a lot of times I think our natural inclination is, this is what I want to say about my brand. And it's a
Mhm.
lot harder to penetrate because at the end of the day, the way our memories work is in each sort of situation we're in, a memory is somewhat likely to come up. It could be more, or it could be less. And so the more memories that you can tap into and you can attach your brand to, the more likely you're going to be recalled, the more likely someone's going to consider you to be in sort of that initial conversation. And so, yeah, I just find that whole space fascinating.
Yeah. I mean, I think you just proved the case for any young listeners that psychology and philosophy might be a really good background for marketing. Awesome. So outside of that and or related to that, I think you've often talked about your really being data driven in your decision making, but also trying to balance that. And you mentioned a while ago about sort of balancing on the creative side, but on the creative storytelling. So how do you kind of balance the two between, using data to influence, but also kind of narrating the story? It probably ties back to what you were just talking about finding that right intersection of where customers are.
Yeah. And I think in some ways it helps me understand sort of like what we should be doing, and then hopefully enables me to then give the team some space to then run against it. And so, because there's two things that are very true for memory creation and retrieval. One is storytelling. So it's just practically the way our brains work, and some of the things that are released within our brains are influenced by story. So there was to me, a really interesting example back when I was at undergrad, and it was actually in the case of trials. So part of the reason people disproportionately get convicted is because prosecutors tell stories. They also tell emotive stories. And defense attorneys traditionally try and poke holes in stories with reason. And our brain really doesn't care about holes in stories. They just like a nice little narrative that all fits together. And so what they actually found in some testing is that when defense attorneys were more likely to paint a counter narrative, it significantly increased the likelihood people would get off. And so the way I always frame this, and there was a particular example of in murder trials, like potentially going to prison for life. This was really impactful. And I'm like, if it can work there,
Yeah.
imagine how well it can work in marketing, where people are many times making a sort of a less considered decision. And so I think that idea of storytelling, but then also the emotive piece, it tends to increase the likelihood we retain something, but also makes it easier to recall it. And so I'd say that's maybe my structured, more like math approach towards why storytelling and emotion are really important. And that's where I'll also then look to my team and say, hey, these are the things we want to do. These are the motions we're trying to create. This is how our brand is understood from any type of survey that we'll do. Now help me in telling that story. And so I think that's hopefully where I'm a good complement to my team members. And in general, I like to think I'm not getting too much into sort of anyone's day to day, but I think sort of that approach helps me do that, because I know where I want us to go. I can help paint that picture, and then sort of give space for our team to sort of leverage their skill sets to get us there.
Okay, that's fascinating. I'm like playing out on like all the trial shows and things that I watch, and that's exactly right. I feel like that storytelling is powerful. Yeah, and that's usually why opening and closing arguments are so important, because they recap that story. Like use the trial itself to dispute facts or present evidence or whatever. But at the end of the day, like that story is what they're going to hold on to. Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm trying to teach my kids that a little bit. Because I don't know, I don't think that like math and science were my specialty. Is probably why I ended up in engineering. But my like English, whatever, like I was terrible. I hated reading. You'd read the like long story and they answer questions like, what's the main idea? What's
Yeah,
the
yeah, yeah.
and I never read them as a story. I would like sort of read it as a series of facts and then try to come up with the main idea, which was typically like, what's the first sentence of the second paragraph? That's probably the main idea. And I always did terribly on it. And I think it was because I didn't sort of absorb like the heart of the narrative. I was trying to pick out like one line or two lines here to
Mhm.
expect that to be the summary sentence. And so I'm trying to teach my kids like, hey, when you read this, like think about the story. Like somebody's telling you a story first, and then the questions will be so much easier. And of course, they're way better at it than I am. But
Well, it's, I mean, just a related thing. I mean, part of the reason stories are so impactful is research has found the way that our brains work is we'll take an external story and we'll try and embed it into an internal story that we have. And so we actually internalize that stories into our own. And sometimes you can actually get confused and think a story you heard is actually something that happened to you because you tend to meld those things together. Whereas if you just provide facts, that doesn't happen. So yeah, I intellectually understand that stories are very, very important. I try and get us there and then try and make sure that as a team, we pull those together effectively.
Well, I think what you just did, though, is prove that you have to close the loop, because back to what we were talking about earlier, if we want those stories to be internalized, meaning they have to relate to them, like in some way and apply it to their own story, means that we should probably test our messaging and test that storytelling with customers, right? Like, is this resonating? Is it working? Because then you're driving home, like, is this something they can kind of get around? Does this resonate with a true pain point or challenge or need state that they have?
Yeah, and something actually I've talked with my teams about, particularly, I feel like a lot of times companies were more comfortable talking about how amazing our products are. And a story about how amazing your product is probably not going to be internalized as a story around like, hey, this is sort of your day-to-day life, and this is what you're going through, and this is what you're trying to solve, and then this is how we can help. And you're like, oh, okay, the only thing I needed to add in was this is how we can help, because everything else I'm experiencing on a day-to-day basis. Is it sort of reinforcing that story that we already have in our head.
Yeah, I love that. Speaking of stories, you have mentioned before that in marketing, you think being distinctive is different than being different. What does that mean? Like in terms of the way that you, like, how do you convert that into action? What does that mean?
Yeah, and it's so the sort of at its core, being distinct means just standing out. Being different actually means, like how, I have a competitor and this is why you should choose me over them. I mean, for anyone who's listening, something I would encourage you to do if you haven't already is do a survey of the market and ask how people think about you and ask people how they think about their competitors. And what you'll find is there's a lot less difference there than you probably would expect. And I've done this at a number of companies, including looking at win-loss analysis and asking why they choose you versus someone else. There's a lot less that actually teases out the differences than one would necessarily expect to see. And if that's true at the bottom of the funnel, or when people are truly considering, certainly at the very top, you have very little likelihood of getting across like the one or two reasons why you're different than your biggest competitor. So the most important thing is understand those buying situations, stand out in those buying situations so that you can then be considered and sort of brought into the process. And probably many of you have heard this stat, but essentially like 80 to 90% of buyers in the B2B space have a day one list. 90% of the time, they're going to choose from that day one list. And so the most important thing we can do as marketers is actually get on that day one list, which is normally before you've done all that differentiation and comparison. And doing that by being distinctive is really important. Something that the Ehrenberg Bass will say is that if they look at how individual companies stand out, normally the highest correlation is between the company and the vertical. And so really all of us are just branded versions of the category. And so the more we can be associated with a category and the more we can be associated with the buying situation, the better off we are. And so that's just where we should try and focus our time and effort.
Interesting. I talk to my team a lot about the narrative and the message being different when we are category selling versus competitive selling, meaning when we are trying to, for us, for demand-based, whether we are trying to sell somebody on the idea of an account-based strategy versus when we are trying to win a head-to-head with a competitor, like maybe it's a switcher or something from
for sure.
Competitor. Do you think that aligns with distinct versus different? Like, is that maybe when you would use those?
And I mean, I would imagine normally when people are considering you versus someone else, they're further down in the funnel. They're going to be a little bit more tuned in, paying attention, looking for reasons to make that decision. And so I think that does then make a lot of sense. Yeah. I think people sort of say whether it's sort of 90% of buyers are not in a buying process at any time. It's essentially just a function of like how long is your buying process and how many years. So if it's people spend a quarter thinking about something and it's every 4 years, 25% divided by 4, sort of 6 and a bit percent. That's where that comes from. But so for the vast majority of people you're marketing to, it's more of that distinctive message. And then when people are actively in the buying process, it probably makes more sense to highlight why they should be choosing you. What are the reasons to focus on you relative to someone else? And so I think they both can be true, but probably different parts of the evaluation cycle.
Yeah, I think that's fascinating. Yeah, that's cool. I love it. Well, cool. Okay, so all of this stuff we're talking about is awesome and cerebral and very exciting to think through. But we also, the market's going fast. I mean, you and I are both sitting in spaces that are having a ton of innovation right now, ton of risk right now, ton of like all the challenges that we've had. How do you balance sort of that thoughtfulness and that great message and that great narrative with just speed and efficiency and velocity that we need in order to
and trying to get things out the door? Yeah, and it's It can be tough for a number of reasons. Obviously, the market's moving quickly. Potentially, you have internal stakeholders that are moving quickly. There's always sort of the new product release, and how do you get that out there? There are a couple of things that sit behind the thinking and then the way we approach. So I feel like there's a lot of maybe increased focus now on like how much do we personalize and how much do we sort of tailor our message. My general bias is let's be very targeted in who we go after, but we want to try and ladder up to the same themes. Warren's Neuroscience Initiative, which does a lot of research in this space, has found that the more people that have a consistent understanding of your brand, the faster your brand grows. And so that's where I try and create more like consistency over time and being consistently distinctive. Where I do think about sort of being nimble and pivoting and moving quickly is the testing side. So whether it's using synthetic audiences to quickly get insights around how people might think about the space. So like Evidenza as a company, for example, I sort of have used a lot in the past, or just trying things out on sort of an ad or sort of on your webpage and just seeing what works. I think that's where you can sort of balance the, like, we know we need to ladder into sort of the same message over time with, we may try different versions of how to get there. Or maybe we have a debate of like, what is that long-term message and how are we going to try and test it out? But I think a core value that we can provide for marketing is saying, I know we want to constantly change. I know we want to constantly iterate, but that's just practically not how people internalize, particularly if they're tuned out of our messaging for the majority of their time because they're not in a buying situation or they have like lots of products they're thinking about. The way we're going to pierce through and go from like they don't care about us to like, oh, maybe they're going to look at our ad, to maybe they're going to internalize the ad, to like maybe they're going to think we might be relevant, is hammering over and over and over again on those same points. And so I just do think we need to figure out that balance of long-term versus willingness to tweak, iterate, test, and sort of learn and grow.
Yeah, for sure. So on that spirit of kind of testing and iterating and moving fast, how are you guys working AI into your world, specifically in the marketing world? Maybe it's across the company. I know you're in the cybersecurity space, so I'm sure there's all kinds of red flags about using any of it, but just curious how you guys are thinking about it.
Well, interestingly, we just had sort of a big conference for our space last week, and I think pretty much everyone is talking about why they are AI first, and they've always been using AI. So it's definitely a message that people are trying to get out. And then we're selling into chief information security officers who are all about protecting data. And so they're at the same time freaked out about the fact that everyone in their company is using AI. But in terms of how we go to market and how we're trying to leverage it, I think there's an incredible number of opportunities. One, as I mentioned, when you're thinking about sort of market research or understanding your customers, sort of synthetic audiences, when you're thinking about which accounts to focus on and how you leverage intent. So we're demand-based customers and very appreciative of all the ways that you've incorporated AI into the platform, because it is really important to think about how do I amass all of that data together and then be thoughtful in who I go after and target them at the right time and not waste dollars. Definitely there are ways to leverage AI for creating content and doing it at scale, particularly as you're trying to make something more vertically relevant. I actually use it a lot and was using it last week as I'm preparing for conversations with individual accounts. So like, what do we know based on potentially call recording and emails that we've had and just sort of general activities, and doing it both for myself, but also how we're doing account planning with sales. So I think those are all potential areas. Localization for global companies, that's a really great way to take advantage of it. I think the biggest thing for me is looking at all of your processes and your workflows and saying, where could I streamline? Where could I get sort of a step closer leveraging AI, and then obviously have a person who then complements it? And so I'm not so much seeing it as a sort of a replacement vehicle, but more a way just to make us way more powerful and more sort of successful in our efforts, and hopefully pull together data we would just never have a chance to be able to do because we're bound by the need to sleep sometimes.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, I feel the exact same way. I don't see it as a means of replacing headcount, and that's not my vision right now. I'm sure that'll happen at some point, but mine is really about just accelerating the productivity and impact of the team, because they can just get so much more out. And so maximizing our content, creating more derivatives and creating, more assets that we can use and promote. So I see it sort of as more of a revenue accelerator, like you're going in smarter to those account planning meetings, or you're going in smarter into a customer meeting because you're able to sort of synthesize so much data faster, which is pretty powerful.
Well, in something coming from a company that sold a lot into sort of SDRs and sales teams, and now having the SDR organization, within my team, I think one of the things that I've heard as potential pushbacks is AI isn't great, it's imperfect. But many times when you have a lot of people on your team who are maybe earlier in their career, they're also not always perfect. And so it can actually be really helpful to leverage AI, even if it's just a starting spot to then build off of. But sometimes it actually does up level the quality of the things you're creating.
Yeah. I had fun. I had two fun AI stories this week, which I thought were like just straight Gen AI stories. One was my son had an MRI and they sent me the report and of course like the results of the MRI. And they said, please set up an appointment with the doctor to go through these and we'll talk through them. So I was like, okay. And I was about to make the appointment. I was like, well, I'm just going to copy and paste this like medical jargon in. So I dropped it in, it came back and essentially the summary was there is absolutely nothing wrong with your kid. And I'm like, why would I take the time to go have this follow-up appointment now that essentially
Yeah.
ChatGPT was like, yeah, this basically says that there's nothing wrong with the bone, nothing wrong with the muscle, nothing. And I'm like, I mean, it's crazy.
That's awesome.
The second one was my son was trying to decide between two schools to play college football. And so I loaded in to do a pro and con comparison, but I started it with, which is my favorite advice from Brandon Herder. Do you remember Brandon?
Yeah.
He gave me advice once that you should always start your prompts with act like a blank to set your persona. So I said, act like a 17-year-old high school football running back who blah, 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 you know, from Austin, Texas, who, whatever.
Yeah.
And then tell me the pros and cons of these schools. And it comes back and the first two words are bet that. And I was like, it's literally going to talk to me like I'm a 17-year-old boy right here. And then it was like, both schools are fire, which again, I was like, all right, we are like in high school jargon. But then it went on, but then it was like, had this EQ that I was really sort of impressed by, like things like, hey, remember this one's, you know, only 2.5 hours away. Your mom and dad are really going to appreciate getting to watch you play and all kinds of stuff. And I was like, there was like something that like, it wasn't like facts and figures. It can think and it's intelligent to your point. Like, it may not be perfect, but none of us are perfect. It's close enough to perfect to get you started on a lot of things. But I just thought it was so funny that it came back to me and literally talked to me like I was 17 and had spoken my language and was like, man, your fam's going to love the stadium at whatever. The hot dogs are on point or something. Like it just talked, the whole thing was like I was a 17-year-old kid. And it was funny.
That's awesome. You know, my girls have a few years to get there, but I look forward to hearing them chat like that.
Yeah, it was my favorite prompt, like just inserting that act like a blank persona. And then it spoke in a language that was reasonable. So anyway, pretty smart. Maybe SDRs can do that. Act like a 25-year-old SDR who's outbounding for the first time.
Yeah, what would you say?
Yeah. Well, cool. All right. So the primary audience, we'll wrap up with a couple more questions. One is primary audience here is either CMOs who are fairly early in their career who are looking for sort of tips on how to go, you know, how to get better and better, or they are that stage right before, like a senior director, VP who wants to be a CMO. So knowing that you've been through this path, what is your advice to folks at that kind of like brink of CMO stage that maybe something you wish you had known when you were at that stage that you've sort of learned now after a few years in seat? What can they do about it now?
Yeah, so maybe a few things, and I don't know if this is true for you, Kelly, but when I was first trying to get into the CMO space and was talking to recruiters and exec recruiters, I think we get our world gets overly simplified into like, do you do brand, do you do demand, or do you do product marketing? And for most of us, you've normally grown up in one of those areas and you potentially haven't done all three. And so like when I was at Tableau and I was talking to my boss about my desire to move into the CMO space, she said, hey, what can we start to do to help you get exposure to some of those other areas so that you can truthfully say you've done some of those things in that space? Because I think many times it's like checking a box of like, okay, do you have some exposure? So I think it is important to think about sort of your experience that way, just because it will be something that you're evaluated on, whether or not you're explicitly asked about it. I think the second piece is, you know, like where are you willing to, kind of as I mentioned at the beginning, where are you willing to take risks that others might not be able to? And so, potentially you feel very comfortable moving to a sort of a new place where others might not, or you're willing to, be at a company that, is earlier stage in its career, or potentially is going to go through a turnaround and it's going to be tough while it goes through. I think that's a really important area that might give you a leg up on some others if you're intentionally making those pieces. And then when you're coming in, so much of marketing takes a while to actually demonstrate returns. And so you need to have allies in sort of the broader leadership group. And I've always thought, in particular, having the CRO and the CFO sort of on my side is really key. Obviously, the head of product is another really important one. But so understanding like what they care about, like do they have potentially who you're selling into. Like, are there accounts that you might have relationships at that you can actually help get a deal to come through really quickly? Or on the finance side, can you quickly identify some savings and say, hey, I'm going to give something back to the business, so that you sort of checked a box of, oh, this person's, focused on creating savings for the company. Those first few months is so critical to your ability to succeed, and whether or not you've built trust allows you to then get some latitude while you're trying to make sort of broader changes. And then I would say, along those lines, figure out how you can make those small wins while you want to make bigger changes, because you'll never get a chance to make the bigger changes if you don't get the small wins. And so I think those would be some of the things that I would call out. And then the last thing is, you're not going to know everything. And so with your team, pretending like you do is a recipe for them to not trust you. I think you need to be open and candid of like, hey, this is an area I'm learning. I'm really curious. I want to understand. And that also, if you're moving into a new company, ties into you don't know the company. And so if you come in with sort of, these are all the things I'm going to change, you're going to get organ rejection. And so you need to sort of learn from people, just from both from a domain perspective, but also because they've been at the company, and you just need to win the hearts and minds, sometimes more than sort of their brains, if you're going to be successful.
Yeah, I mean, every single one of those resonated. I feel like I've experienced all of those at various stages. What I really love about what you said is it's a mix of hard skills and soft skills. Like the hard skills of like learning different functional areas, getting that exposure, softer skills of admitting that you don't know things that you don't know, building relationships with CFOs and CROs, surrounding yourself with people who are experts in areas that you might not be, to help complement the skills. I think that's the balance. I think there's often, as folks see, as they check off functional skill boxes, they see a need or a belief that they are able to keep moving up in their career. But the challenge is that stuff you can accelerate, right? You can learn that stuff quickly. You can be a fast study and move up. The softer skills, like rushing that timeline, is very different, I think. Like learning to build relationships with the CFO and CRO and understanding what makes them tick. That's not something you do like in a couple meetings and check the box. Like that takes years in seat to kind of figure out. Or like you said, like being like vulnerable enough to tell your team that like, hey, I've never done SEO, for example. Like I want to sit down and learn this so that I can lead and remove bottlenecks for you, but also let you be the expert in, but I need to be able to at least ask the right questions. So help me learn. Like those take time. And I think that's the part that's hard when people are super motivated or ambitious to move up in their career. They sort of underestimate the time it takes to develop that side of the role.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. And I think that was definitely a learning for me as I was coming up in my career, was many times and obviously you want to be thoughtful about sort of how and when you do it, but the more open and candid you can be about sort of where you do bring some perspective and you're going to have strong opinions, but also areas where you really would love to be able to like learn and get their take and whatnot. At the end of the day, I think we all want to do well. We all want to contribute. We all want to feel like our contributions are important and we're being listened to. And so I think if you treat other people in that same way, people generally reciprocate. And I think I always go back to something I learned in sort of psychology, which was this idea that, when people like you, they tend to associate good things with you and bad things with the sort of environment. But when they don't know you as well, or maybe they don't like you, it's the opposite. And so that it's not just about doing a good job. You need to have the framing around doing the good job. And then practically we're all going to make mistakes. And so you just need to have the sort of the trust and sort of the relationship to allow you to navigate through it.
Yeah. That was kind of like what you and I were just talking about earlier today, about those. That trust and relationship goes a long way, especially when businesses, when business situations get challenging. So having that trust to lean on definitely assumes the intention is positive.
Yeah, totally agree.
Cool. All right, last question. Totally unrelated to this. Any fun fact about Bryan Law that the world should know about you?
So this was something I did think about when I was in college. I always wanted to live and work on every continent outside of like Antarctica. And that was a real goal that I had. And I've been lucky enough through the jobs to do quite a bit of it. So, I lived obviously here. I was living down in Brazil for a while. I'm originally from South Africa and got to live back there in Mozambique. I was in India, Australia. I've never gotten to Europe, and it's still on my list. It's not on my wife's list, so I'm trying to convince her. But yeah, I've just really been constantly fascinated by people in different cultures. And I feel like it's just made my life so much richer having those experiences. And I just, it's pushed me and stretched me in different ways. So there you go.
The one you haven't worked in is Europe. Like
It would
that's,
have been probably like the most like logical first place to go.
you see
Yeah,
that expat situation probably more than any other country or any other.
yeah. That had been my original, first planned step, and for whatever reason, a little bit harder to come by. But I keep telling my wife at some point in time we need to make it happen.
That's right. Especially while the girls are young.
Yeah.
I had forgotten you're from South Africa too. Very cool. Awesome. Well, if people want to follow you, which I'm sure they will, they'll be fascinated by hearing all about you. So LinkedIn, is that the right
Yep.
place to find you?
That's the best way, and certainly try to have a sort of an active presence on LinkedIn. And I found through that I've gotten just exposure to some people who have really great thoughts, ideas, and I learn a ton from. So feel free to reach out.
Awesome. Well, great. Well, thank you so much for joining today. I really enjoyed the conversation.
Same.
Awesome. And everyone else, thanks for listening. We'll see you on the next episode of the Next Gen CMO podcast. Have a great weekend.